He was the kind of man whose life seemed to run in a rut, where every day was as predictable as a page from a well-read book. Age had left a light web of wrinkles around his eyes, but there was still confidence in them, the confidence of a man who believed he held his destiny in his strong hands. He had achieved some position, some wealth, and in this cozy world of his own making, he felt like a master. His wife, with whom he had been sharing his home for many years, had become an integral part of this landscape, like an old, reliable piece of furniture that you get so used to that you stop noticing it. She was there, always, like a shadow accompanying him through life. But in that shadow, he saw no glimmer of former passion, no spark of admiration. He looked at her, and there was no malice or hatred in his gaze, only indifferent acceptance. She was as much a part of his life as his morning coffee or the evening paper, familiar, predictable, and therefore utterly devoid of novelty. He could not remember the last time he had seen her as a woman, the last time his heart had throbbed at the sight of her. His world seemed gray, monotonous, and this grayness pressed inexorably upon him, causing an incomprehensible longing. He longed for change, not realizing that the source of his dissatisfaction lay not in external circumstances, but in his own heart. And then, like a flash of lightning in the darkness of night, she appeared in his life. Another woman whose name he uttered with awe, whose eyes lit long-forgotten fires in him. She was the complete opposite of his wife. She was a novelty, a challenge, a promise of something uncharted and exciting. And in this new passion, in this whirlwind of emotions, he began to sink, slowly but surely, forgetting what had once been important to him. His dissatisfaction with his own existence now took on clear contours. His wife seemed to have become an anchor keeping him from flying, from the bright and carefree life he craved. And in this euphoria, in this state of dazzle, he began to take the steps that would change his destiny forever. And so, as if mesmerized, he stepped onto a path where every step seemed to lead to a dazzling light. Romance with her was like a sip of ice water on a hot day, refreshing, invigorating, getting rid of stuffy routine. The world around him became brighter, colors more saturated, and gray everyday life seemed to dissolve in a haze of memories. He plunged into this new world with his head, forgetting about what he had left behind. Every date, every touch, every word she said seemed to confirm his rightness, his choice. His wife, the one with whom he shared his home and life, now seemed to him only a shadow, a ghost of the past, an obstacle to his newfound happiness. He began to take her for granted, like the furniture in a house that you don't notice until you start rearranging it. In his eyes, she was no longer a living person, a symbol of the old life he was so desperate to escape. In this maelstrom of passion and euphoria, it was as if he had lost his bearings. The desire to start again, from scratch, became an obsession. In a rush of emotion, giving in to the impulse and without thinking about the consequences, he made a decision that seemed to him the only right. The apartment, built by their joint efforts, the place where they once dreamed of the future, became a mere bargaining chip, a means to achieve what they wanted. The sale of the apartment was not just a transaction, it was an act of cutting off the past, a symbolic break with what he considered fetters. He believed that this transaction would open the door to a new, cloudless life where there would be no room for routine and boredom. His mind was clouded with the illusion of an easy and carefree future in which he saw only himself and his new chosen one. He did not notice how his selfishness, like a thick fog, enveloped his consciousness, blinding him and depriving him of the ability to see beyond his own nose. He could no longer hear the voice of reason, drowned out by the insistent whispering of desires and passions. A conflict had erupted in his soul, where duty and responsibility were overthrown by desire, and reality gave way to illusion. But did he have the right to dispose not only of his own life, but of others' lives as well? This question loomed like a shadow on the periphery of his consciousness, but he tried hard to ignore it. The rustle of time, like an elusive wind, swept through the days of his new life, and with it, the vague illusions began to melt and dissipate. What had seemed a captivating novelty now revealed its fragile and deceptive nature. Years spent in the abyss of passion left behind only a bitter aftertaste of disappointment. Overnight, he realized that what he thought was the beginning was only an escape from himself. Like a sleepwalker awakening from a strange dream, he suddenly realized that his so-called new life had brought him neither peace nor the desired happiness. A vague premonition arose in his soul that he had made an irreparable mistake. With a heavy heart, he returned to the house that had once been his fortress, his harbor. In the back of his mind, there was a faint hope that there, behind the familiar walls, forgiveness awaited him, that the wife he had so thoughtlessly left would understand and take him back. He longed to see in her eyes at least a hint of his former love, a willingness to start over. But reality came upon him like an icy shower. The door he opened led not into a cozy world, but into a cold and empty silence. The apartment, witness to their life together, now seemed alien and lifeless. There was no familiar furniture, no familiar details, not even the smell of her presence. In this gaping space, he suddenly felt lost and alone. He was like a ship wrecked in a raging sea. His world, which he had so arrogantly reshaped, had turned to ruins. Instead of the warmth and support he expected, he was met with an icy emptiness. Confusion shackled him like chains, and a sharp sense of disappointment stirred in his heart. His illusions had shattered like crystal, and the shards of those unfulfilled hopes hurt his soul. He stood, motionless, in the center of that empty apartment, as if a mute reproach to himself. His act, which had seemed so bold and decisive, now revealed its true consequences. He realized that his escape from the past had turned into an escape from himself. In this depressing silence, he was forced to face his mistakes. His actions had consequences, and now he had to accept them in all their bitter fullness. But even in this grim realization, he did not yet understand the depth of his loss. There was still much to understand about what he had destroyed, unwittingly. And there he stood, on the threshold of the very apartment where laughter had once sounded, where every corner held the imprints of their life together. But now there was silence, cold and tinkling, like a shard of broken mirror. He had expected anything: screams, recriminations, tears of despair, but instead he was met with emptiness. Not a single thing to remind him of her, not a single note, not a single trace of her presence. She was simply gone, vanished into thin air, as if she had never been a part of his world. It was far more frightening than any anger, any hysteria. It was a silent judgment without a word, a sentence he'd passed on himself. He stepped inside, and every step echoed in the empty rooms. The walls seemed to whisper to him of his mistakes, of how he had carelessly discarded everything that was truly valuable. He remembered how he had sold this apartment, how confident he had been in his choice, how he had thought he was starting a new, brighter, and fuller life. But the new life turned out to be only an illusion, a mirage that dissipated, leaving him alone with the desert of his own heart. He searched those empty rooms for something to cling to, some thread of hope, but found only a reflection of his own worthlessness. Somewhere in the depths of his soul, among the shards of shattered illusions, a sense of guilt began to sprout. It was bitter, burning, like a poison slowly eating away at him from the inside. He realized that he had deceived not only her, but himself as well. He had betrayed the one who had been by his side for years, who had shared his joys and sorrows, who had loved him no matter what. He had traded loyalty for fleeting passion, trust for deceit, and now he was left with nothing. His selfish desires, his thirst for novelty and thrills, had brought him to ruin. He had not just lost his home, he had lost his support, his love, his respect, all the things that were the foundation of his existence. Now, standing in the middle of this void, he realized that true values lie not in passion and novelty, but in respect and caring for those around him. Love is not a firework of emotions, but a safe haven where one can find peace and solace. He realized that you can't buy happiness. You can't replace love with something else. She didn't make a scandal, didn't throw hurtful words in his face. She simply walked away, leaving him alone with his remorse. Her departure was more eloquent than any shouting. The silence in the apartment was deafening than any quarrel. He realized that his life was ruined, and now he would have to live with the consequences of his actions. But maybe his story is only part of a more complex and multifaceted picture, where every act has its echoes and every decision has its consequences, and there is something else waiting to be fully understood. And so, he stood in the middle of this empty, droning silence, where the echo of his own footsteps seemed to mock his former confidence. The walls, once witnesses to their life together, now stared silently at his disappointment. He returned, driven by some vague hope, wanting to see at least a hint of forgiveness, a chance to return to the world he had so carelessly destroyed. But where once there had been comfort and warmth, there was only an icy emptiness, a reflection of his own devastated heart. Like a blind man who only saw after losing his sight, he finally realized the depth of his mistake. There were no more illusions, no more excuses. He saw how his selfish desires had torn his life apart like birds of prey, leaving only ashes and regret. The love and respect he had so carelessly discarded turned out to be not just words, but the very foundation without which no solid building can exist. He realized that they could not be bought, could not be exchanged for fleeting passions, could not be replaced by anything but themselves. His life now is a ruin, a consequence of his choices that he must accept. This is not just the end of the story, it is the beginning of his long and painful journey to reinvent himself. A lesson he has learned, bitter but necessary. True happiness, as it turns out, does not hide in deceit and selfish impulses, but lies in caring for those around him, in respecting their feelings, in the ability to appreciate what you have before you lose it forever. He has suffered the realization that running away from problems does not lead to solutions, but only exacerbates their consequences. His remorse now is not just regret for the past, but the realization that he must live with it, with this weight on his heart, until he comes to understand how to pick himself up from the shards. And in that silence, among the empty rooms, he began to hear, as if for the first time, the voice of conscience whispering not only of what had been lost, but also of what remained behind the scenes of the story, of something yet to be understood.